The ranch had been quiet for too long. For 10 years, silence had filled its wooden halls, broken only by the sound of boots on the porch, cattle lowing in the distance, and the wind that dragged dust across the empty plains. Ezra Callahan lived alone among those sounds. He woke before dawn, worked the fields, tended the stock, and slept without speaking a word to anyone but his horses. It was loneliness that pushed him toward the small advertisement clipped from a territorial newspaper. Mail order bride available. Gentle disposition, blonde hair, blue eyes, seeking honest rancher willing to provide stable home. Ezra had read those lines until the paper grew soft at the folds. He answered with a letter scrawled by lantern light, his pen scratching awkwardly across the page. The correspondence that followed was simple, careful, steady. Each letter carried a small piece of hope. The woman's words were tidy, her descriptions plain but kind. She spoke of a fondness for baking, for reading scripture in the evenings, for caring for chickens and gardens. Ezra pictured her as delicate, soft-spoken, someone who might fill the aching silence of his home with warmth. He carved a ring out of oak, smoothing the edges with hours of patient work. It sat in a small box on his nightstand, waiting. On the morning the stagecoach was due, Ezra wore his cleanest shirt and brushed the dust from his hat. He stood at the station, heart drumming like it hadn't since his youth. Around him, neighbors gathered with quiet curiosity. Mail-order brides arriving were rare, and a man's choice often became the talk of the valley. Ezra felt their eyes on him as the rumble of wheels echoed across the dry earth. The stagecoach lurched into view, a cloud of dust rising behind it. Horses frothed with sweat as the driver pulled them to a halt. Ezra gripped the oak ring box in his pocket, rehearsing the words he might say. "Welcome home. I'm glad you came." The door creaked open. Boots touched the ground, and the world shifted. She was not the woman from the photograph. The figure who stepped down from the woman looked directly at him. Then she reached into her bag and produced a folded envelope. Ezra's name was written on it, in the same careful hand as the letters he had carried in his breast pocket for months. Confusion and shame burned through him all at once. He felt the weight of the townsfolk's eyes, heard the hiss of whispers carried on the hot wind. That's not what he ordered. That's not the blonde woman he promised to marry. The woman didn't flinch. She held the letter steady, her hand firm despite the tremor at her side. Ezra stepped forward, his boots heavy against the platform boards. He took the envelope, recognized the handwriting, and felt the bottom of his stomach drop. This was no trick. This was the bride. She spoke then, her voice low but clear. The accent was different than he had imagined, softer, marked by places he had never seen. "Ezra Callahan," she asked, his name careful on her tongue. He nodded stiffly, unable to trust his voice. "My name is Clara," she said. The crowd shifted behind him. Someone spat into the dust. Someone else muttered a curse under their breath. Ezra kept his eyes on her, trying to reconcile the months of letters with the woman who now stood in front of him. The photograph had been a lie, or perhaps not hers at all, but the words, the warmth he had clung to in lonely nights, had been hers. He could see it in the way she met his gaze without apology, in the steady strength she carried despite the stares. For a moment, Ezra's hand drifted toward the ring box in his pocket. Then he let it fall away. The stagecoach was gone, the dust already settling. Clara stood alone on the platform, her small bundle clutched tight, her eyes scanning the horizon as if measuring the distance she would have to walk if he turned her away. Ezra swallowed hard. His throat felt dry as the prairie around them. He turned slightly, caught the eyes of Samuel Rowe from the general store, who was watching with thinly veiled contempt. Others looked away quickly, pretending they weren't waiting for a spectacle. Ezra thought of the empty house, the long winters, the silence pressing in like a weight. Then he thought of the promises he had made in his letters, the words he had written about honesty, faith, and companionship. He straightened, lifted Clara's bundle from her hands, and nodded toward his wagon. The whispers grew louder, but Ezra didn't stop. Clara followed him without a word, her steps long and measured. The crowd parted reluctantly, making way as man and woman walked together into the blazing light of the frontier afternoon. The road stretched wide and unforgiving before them, dust swirling like the beginning of a storm. Ezra did not know what waited at its end. but the silence in his chest felt less heavy than it had the day before. The wagon wheels groaned under the weight of supplies as Ezra guided the horses down the dusty road. Clara sat beside him, her bundle resting on her lap, her hands folded tightly over it as if she feared someone might tear it away. For several miles, neither spoke. The prairie rolled out around them, endless grass broken by the dark line of cottonwoods along the river. The silence between them wasn't the familiar kind Ezra had lived with for years. It was sharp, restless, alive with questions he couldn't yet shape into words. At last, Clara spoke. "This land," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon, "is wide." Her accent bent the words in ways Ezra had never heard before, but the meaning was clear enough. "It is," he answered, his voice rough. "Too wide some days." She nodded, saying nothing more, but the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, as if she understood the weight behind his words. By the time the wagon rattled into his yard, the sun was sinking low, painting the world in red and gold. The cabin stood small but sturdy against the open land, its porch sagging at one corner, the barn weathered but strong. Ezra saw it as he imagined she did, lonely, modest, rough. Hardly the picture a woman might have painted for herself after weeks of travel. Clara studied it carefully, her dark eyes scanning every detail, but she didn't frown. Instead, she climbed down, smoothed her dress, and stood straight, taller than Ezra by more than a head. For the first time, he felt the difference between them, not just in skin, but in stature. She was formidable, not delicate, and that truth pressed on him like a revelation. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Ezra had scrubbed the floors the day before, stacked wood by the hearth, and laid out clean linens in the spare room. He had imagined welcoming a pale-haired woman into this space, imagined her voice lifting against the silence. Now Clara stood in the doorway, her presence filling the room in ways he hadn't prepared for. She set her bundle down gently on the table and unwrapped it. Inside was little more than a folded shawl, a worn Bible, and a photograph of a family Ezra didn't know. She touched the sparks until the kindling caught. He didn't know how to ask the questions gnawing at him. Why had she written the way she had? Why the photograph of someone else? Why him? When he finally spoke, his words came halting. "The letters, they were yours, not mine." The truth landed heavy, though he had already known it. Still, hearing her admit it made something tighten in his. "Would you have written back if you had seen me?" Ezra opened his mouth, then shut it again. The answer clawed at his throat. He wanted to say yes, wanted to claim he would have answered out of honesty, out of faith. But the truth was harder. He had answered because of the promise of something familiar, something the neighbors would approve of. He had clung to an image of comfort, not challenge. Clara saw his silence for what it was. She nodded once, as if she had expected it. Ezra turned back to the fire, the shadows dancing across his weathered hands. He felt a weight pressing on him, of choice, of shame, of possibility. They ate supper in near silence, a simple meal of bread, beans, and salted pork. Clara ate without complaint, her posture straight, her movements careful. When the meal was done, she stood and washed the dishes without being asked, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her strong hands steady in the water. Ezra watched from his chair, something stirring in him he couldn't name. Not desire, not yet, something quieter, deeper, a recognition of resilience. When the last dish was set aside, Clara dried her hands and turned toward him. "You did not expect me," she said simply. "No," Ezra admitted, "but I am here." The words carried more weight than he understood, but he felt them settle into the bones of the house, into the silence that had lived there so long. That night, Ezra lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling beams. In the room across the hall, Clara's breathing was steady, calm. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the faint murmur of coyotes. Ezra thought of the neighbors' whispers, of the stairs on the platform, of the oak ring in his pocket that no longer fit the hand he had imagined. But he also thought of Clara's steady gaze, of the way she had faced the crowd without flinching, of the strength in her quiet words. "I am here." And for the first time in years, Ezra felt the silence of his home begin to shift. Not vanish, not yet, but bend, making space for something new. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains, cutting pale lines across the floorboards. Ezra rose before dawn, as always, pulling on his boots and hat before stepping outside to tend the stock. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dew and earth, but already the horizon shimmered with the promise of another scorching day. He had expected to return and find Clara still asleep, worn from her long journey. Instead, she was already outside, her tall frame outlined against the rising sun. She carried a bucket in each hand, water sloshing as she moved with deliberate steps from the well to the barn. Ezra froze, watching as she worked. There was no hesitation in her movements, no sign of inexperience. She had tied her skirt at the knees for ease, and her bare arms flexed with strength that made him blink. "You don't need to," he began, but she cut him off with a look that was neither sharp nor unkind. "I can work," she said simply, and she did. All that morning, Clara moved about the ranch with quiet purpose. She fed the chickens, stacked firewood, even patched the leaning fence behind the barn with a skill that surprised him. Ezra had lived years in solitude, his chores stretching long into the evenings. To see them halved, to watch someone else shoulder the burden without complaint, left him unsettled in ways he hadn't expected. Neighbors came by mid-morning. Word of the mismatched bride had already spread, faster than wildfire across dry grass. Mrs. Henderson arrived first, her lips pressed thin as she took in the sight of Clara standing tall in the yard, hammer in hand. Behind her came Samuel Price, the blacksmith, pretending he had business with Ezra, but unable to hide his curiosity. "She's not the woman in the letters," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her eyes darting from Ezra to Clara. "No," Ezra answered, his voice flat. "And you're keeping her." Ezra's jaw tightened. Before he could reply, Clara stepped forward, wiping sweat from her brow. "I am here to stay," she said, her voice calm but firm, each word carrying weight. The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Henderson muttered something under her breath and departed, skirts swishing angrily. Samuel lingered a moment longer, then tipped his hat and left without another word. When the dust of their departure settled, Ezra felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He had known the town would talk, had braced himself for their judgment. But hearing Clara speak for herself, watching her stand against their stares, stirred something inside him that no gossip could shake. By midday, the sun blazed overhead. Ezra and Clara shared bread and cold water on the porch, their silence companionable this time. She sat tall, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her hands resting loosely in her lap. "Why here?" Ezra asked at last. "Why this ranch?" Clara turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes. For a moment she said nothing, and he thought she might refuse to answer. Then quietly, "Because it is far. Far from where I was. Far enough to begin again." Ezra studied her face, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her gaze. She offered no further detail, and he didn't press her. He understood the need for distance, for silence about the past. His own life was built on it. That evening, storm clouds gathered over the prairie. Ezra secured the livestock while Clara brought in the wash, the two of them moving with practiced efficiency, though they had only just begun this uneasy partnership. When the rain finally broke, pounding against the roof and rattling the shutters, they sat together inside, the lamp casting warm light across the small room. Ezra found himself speaking words he hadn't planned. "I thought I wanted someone delicate, someone quiet. But you—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Clara watched him steadily. "I am not delicate," she said, not with pride, but with simple honesty. "No," Ezra agreed. Then after a pause, "But maybe I don't need delicate." The storm raged outside, wind howling through the cracks, but inside the cabin, a different silence grew. Softer, less sharp. Ezra felt it settle between them like a fragile bridge, something unspoken yet undeniable. When the thunder rolled away and the rain softened, Clara stood and gathered her bundle from the table. She pulled out the photograph once more, studying it in the lamplight. Ezra caught sight of the faces again, smiling, unfamiliar, long gone. "Family?" he asked quietly. Clara's hand lingered on the image, her expression unreadable. Was, she said. Then she wrapped it carefully and placed it back in the cloth. Ezra said nothing more, but as he banked the fire for the night, he realized the question that mattered wasn't who she had been or where she had come from, but what they might become here, on this stretch of lonely land neither of them had expected to share. The days rolled into one another, stitched together by the rhythm of work. Ezra rose early, and more often than not, Clara was already awake, moving through the morning light with the same steadiness she had shown that first day. She split kindling without complaint, her tall frame bent over the axe, muscles shifting beneath her plain dress. Ezra watched from the doorway once, caught off guard by how natural she looked in the place he had carved out of wilderness. He had expected distance between them, silence heavy with awkwardness. Instead, a different kind of quiet filled the ranch now. An ease born not of words but of shared labor. They worked side by side, and though Ezra rarely spoke more than necessary, he began to notice the small ways Clara adjusted to him. She slowed her stride so he could keep pace, passed tools into his hands without being asked, left food waiting when she knew he'd lose track of time in the fields. The neighbors, however, did not settle so easily. Each trip to town brought more stares, more whispers carried just loud enough for him to hear. A black woman in his house? A wife? Some said it outright. Others let their silence do the talking. Ezra ignored them as best he could, but he felt the weight of their judgment pressing on him. One Saturday, he and Clara stood outside the general store, sacks of flour and sugar balanced on the wagon. A pair of ranchers leaned against the hitching post, eyes fixed on Clara with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You send off for one kind of bride, and you get another," one muttered. "Man ought to demand a refund." Ezra's hand tightened on the reins. Before he could respond, Clara stepped forward, her chin lifted, her dark eyes steady. "I am not a refund," she said, her voice carrying clear across the street. The words landed like stones. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ezra flicked the reins, guiding the wagon away, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Anger, pride, maybe both. Back at the ranch, he found himself pacing the porch, fists clenched. Clara watched him from the doorway, arms folded. "Let them talk," she said finally. "They don't know you," he answered. "They don't need to." Her tone was calm, but her eyes softened. "You know me." The truth of it stopped him cold. He met her gaze, realizing she had already woven herself into the fabric of his days more completely than he had admitted. That night, trouble came. The cattle stirred restlessly, lowing in alarm. Ezra grabbed his lantern and rifle, stepping into the darkness. Clara followed, her own lantern cutting a separate path of light. They found the fence torn, posts splintered where someone had forced it open. Several head of cattle had wandered into the night. Ezra's pulse hammered. Rustlers. They worked quickly, driving the animals back inside, patching the gap as best they could. But when the last cow was safe, Ezra spotted movement at the edge of the mesquite. Shadows slipping away, too deliberate to be chance. He raised his rifle, but the night swallowed them. Clara stood beside him, her breath visible in the chill. "They will come again," she said. He nodded grimly. "And next time, we'll be ready." For the first time since she arrived, Ezra felt the full weight of her presence. Not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as a strength. Together they had faced the storm, the whispers, and now this threat that stalked the edges of their land. When dawn broke, painting the sky in bands of pink and gold, Clara leaned against the porch rail, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Ezra joined her, the silence between them filled not with doubt, but with something steadier. "You regret staying?" he asked quietly. Clara looked out at the wide horizon, the cattle grazing in peace once more, the land stretching endless and unforgiving. "No," she said at last. "This feels like where I was meant to be." Her words sank deep, and Ezra knew then that whatever storms might come, be they whispers from town or shadows in the night, they would face them side by side.